Imagine a currency that has survived the end of empires, the birth of new nations, and the shifting tides of global economics, yet still sparks fierce debate and protest across a continent. The CFA franc is not just money, it's a symbol, a legacy, and for many, a point of contention that sits at the heart of Africa's ongoing struggle for economic sovereignty and self-determination. But what exactly is the CFA franc? Why was it created? How does it work? And why are more and more African countries talking about leaving it behind? If you're curious about the intersection of history, economics, and politics in Africa, or if you've ever wondered how a currency can shape the destiny of entire nations, you're in the right place. As we break down the CFA franc's story, I'd love to know your thoughts. Do you think a shared currency helps or hurts economic independence? Drop your opinions in the comments as we dive in. To understand the CFA franc, we have to travel back to December 1945, when the world was still reeling from World War II and the global financial system was being rebuilt. France, like many colonial powers, was grappling with the realities of a changing world. As part of its commitment to the newly established Bretton Woods system, France created the CFA franc, originally standing for Colonies Françaises d'Afrique, or French Colonies of Africa, to replace the French franc in its African territories. At first glance, this move seemed practical. It protected the colonies from the devaluation of the French franc and tied their economies more closely to France. But from the very beginning, the CFA franc was more than just a currency. It was a tool of economic integration, a mechanism for control, and, some would argue, a chain that tethered African economies to their former colonial ruler. Before we continue, a quick reminder to like this video if you're enjoying the content so far, and don't forget to subscribe to African Finance Watch, your go-to source for Africa's economic insights and business opportunities, trends, and investment opportunities. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest updates. Now let's continue. Today, the CFA franc is actually two separate but linked currencies. The West African CFA franc, XOF, used by 8 countries in the West African Economic and Monetary Union, WAEMU, and the Central African CFA franc, XAF, used by 6 countries in the Economic and Monetary Community of Central African States, CEMAC. Together, these 14 countries represent over 210 million people, and their economies are closely tied to the fate of the CFA franc. But here's a crucial detail. While the two currencies have the same value and are both pegged to the euro at a fixed rate, exactly 655.957 CFA francs to 1 euro, they are not interchangeable. That means a CFA franc from Senegal can't be spent in Cameroon, even though both are called CFA francs. So, how does this system actually work? The CFA franc's most distinctive feature is its fixed exchange rate, first with the French franc, and, since 1999, with the euro. This peg is guaranteed by France, which historically required member countries to deposit at least 50% of their foreign exchange reserves with the French treasury. In return, France promised unlimited convertibility of the CFA franc, meaning that these countries could always exchange their currency for euros at the fixed rate. On paper, this arrangement offered stability. It protected member countries from wild swings in exchange rates, kept inflation low, and made it easier for foreign investors, especially French companies, to do business in the region. But stability comes at a price. Critics argue that the CFA franc system severely limits the monetary sovereignty of its member states. By pegging their currency to the euro and outsourcing monetary policy to European institutions, African countries lose the ability to set interest rates, adjust their money supply, or devalue their currency in response to economic shocks. This means that, unlike countries with independent currencies, CFA franc nations can't use monetary policy to stimulate growth, control inflation, or respond to crises like falling commodity prices. Instead, they must follow rules set in Paris and Frankfurt, often prioritizing stability over development. This arrangement has deep historical roots. The CFA franc was born in an era when France still saw itself as the guardian of its former colonies, and the currency was a way to maintain economic ties and, some would say, control. Over the decades, the system has evolved, but the basic structure remains. France guarantees the currency, sets the rules, and until very recently, held seats on the boards of the African central banks that issue the CFA franc. For many Africans, this is a relic of colonialism, a colonial currency that symbolizes continued dependence on Europe. Protests against the CFA franc have erupted across the continent, with activists burning banknotes and demanding an end to what they see as neo-colonial control. But is the CFA franc really all bad? Supporters point to its track record of low inflation and financial stability, especially when compared to neighboring countries with independent currencies. For example, Côte d'Ivoire, a CFA franc member, has averaged just 6% inflation over the past 50 years, while its neighbor Ghana, which uses its own currency, has seen inflation rates as high as 29%. The fixed exchange rate also makes it easier to import goods, attract foreign investment, and do business across borders. In a region where political instability and economic volatility are common, the CFA franc has provided a measure of predictability that some argue is essential for growth. Yet, the economic picture is far from perfect. Despite decades of stability, CFA franc countries remain among the least developed in the world, with low levels of industrialization, limited export diversification, and weak intra-regional trade. Most of these economies are heavily reliant on primary commodities, think cocoa, cotton, oil, and minerals, which makes them vulnerable to global price swings. Intra-regional trade accounts for less than 10% of total trade among CFA franc countries, a sign that the common currency has not led to deep economic integration or industrial growth. Critics argue that the fixed exchange rate actually hurts development by keeping the currency overvalued, making exports less competitive and discouraging local industry. The political debate around the CFA franc has only intensified in recent years. Rising food and fuel prices, growing youth unemployment, and a new generation of activists have put the currency under unprecedented scrutiny. In Senegal, for example, the slogan, France, dégage, France, get out, has become a rallying cry for those demanding an end to the CFA franc and greater economic independence. Influential economists, civil society groups, and opposition politicians have all called for reform or outright abolition of the currency, arguing that true sovereignty is impossible without control over monetary policy. This pressure has led to real change. In December 2019, the presidents of Côte d'Ivoire and France announced a historic agreement to reform the West African CFA franc and replace it with a new currency called the ECO. Under the deal, the requirement to deposit 50% of foreign exchange reserves with the French Treasury would be scrapped, and French representatives would no longer sit on the board of the West African Central Bank. The ECO would remain pegged to the euro, but the hope was that it would mark a step toward greater autonomy. The announcement was hailed by some as the end of a colonial relic and a new chapter for West Africa. But the road to reform has been anything but smooth. The transition to the ECO has been delayed multiple times, with the latest target date set for July 2027. The COVID-19 pandemic, geopolitical uncertainty, and disagreements among West African states have all contributed to the delays. Some countries are skeptical about the benefits of the new currency, especially since the peg to the euro remains in place, and the mechanisms for monetary policy are still being negotiated. Others worry that abandoning the CFA franc could destabilize their economies, scare off investors, or lead to inflation and currency crises. Meanwhile, the Central African CFA franc remains largely unchanged. The 6 countries of CMAC Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon continue to operate under the old rules, with half their reserves held in Paris and France, guaranteeing the currency's convertibility. For now, there is little movement toward reform in Central Africa, but the debate continues, and the pressure for change is growing. So, why are some countries now choosing to leave the CFA franc altogether? For many, it comes down to sovereignty. Countries like Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali have announced plans to abandon the CFA franc in recent years. arguing that true independence is impossible without control over their own currency. In Senegal, newly elected President Bassirou Diomaye Faye made ending the use of the CFA franc a central part of his campaign, proposing either a single currency for the ECOWAS bloc or a national currency for Senegal. These moves reflect a broader desire among African leaders and citizens to break free from the legacy of colonialism and chart their own economic course. But leaving the CFA franc is not a simple decision. The benefits of stability and investor confidence must be weighed against the desire for sovereignty and the risks of currency volatility. Some countries that left the CFA franc in the past, like Guinea and Madagascar, have struggled with inflation and economic instability, while others, like Mauritania, have managed to build more independent monetary systems. Each country faces unique challenges, and the decision to stay or go is as much political as it is economic. The debate over the CFA franc also raises deeper questions about the future of African integration and development. Can a common currency work without political and economic union? Is it possible to balance the need for stability with the desire for autonomy? And what role should former colonial powers play in the economic life of their former colonies? As the transition to the ECO unfolds and more countries consider leaving the CFA franc, these questions will only become more urgent. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think the CFA franc has helped or hurt the countries that use it? Is it time for Africa to break free from its colonial past and create its own monetary future? Or does the stability of a shared currency outweigh the costs? What lessons can other regions learn from the CFA franc's story? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Let's keep this conversation going. As we look to the future, one thing is clear. The CFA franc, once a symbol of colonial control, is now at the center of a new struggle for economic freedom and self-determination in Africa. Whether it survives, evolves, or is replaced altogether, its legacy will shape the continent's economic destiny for years to come. The journey toward true monetary sovereignty is complex, filled with risks and opportunities, but it is a journey that more and more Africans are determined to undertake. Will the CFA franc become a relic of the past, or can it be reformed to serve the needs of a new generation? Only time and the choices of African nations will tell. If you found this explanation insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your perspective below. Your engagement helps us bring more in-depth stories like this to a wider audience. What topic should we break down next? Let us know in the comments, and thank you for joining us on this exploration of the CFA franc and Africa's quest for economic independence.